Soviet animation is unique and unorthodox. It evolved over the years, beginning with Giga Vertov's avant-garde constructivist experiments with geometric shapes, then moving to the folklore-inspired works of Soyuz-Multfilm, filled with intricate painterly visuals reminiscent of classical Russian art and iconography, before finally embracing funny, charming, slapstick characters set in modern environments. And while the style of Soviet animation was constantly changing, one core principle remained. As it was entirely state-funded, animation always had to reinforce the positive social values of a Soviet citizen: collectivism, modesty, and moral integrity. But what happens when the government changes course? When the political vacuum breaks and newfound freedom of expression floods the world of art and culture? Then animations like Han, His Wife emerge. What makes Han, His Wife unique is that it was created in the period between 1989 and 1990, a pivotal period in Soviet history known as perestroika, or rebuilding, when the Soviet government attempted to restructure the country's political and social systems, introducing freedom of speech and various liberal rights. It was an exciting but also confusing, soul-searching time. Long-haired rockers emerged from the underground and took primetime spots on national television. Newfound political pluralism brought new parties daily, including some odd ones like the Beer Lovers Party. Homosexuality was decriminalized, and publications like Express Newspaper and AIDS Info began to teach Soviet citizens how to have sex. Because, as we know, thanks to the 1986 Soviet-American interview,
Секса у нас нет, и мы категорически против этого.
Previously banned literature, ranging from religious teachings to the works of Freud, became publicly available. These societal shifts deeply influenced Han, His Wife, arguably the most daring and experimental animation in Soviet history. To start, it's essential to note that Han, His Wife was released by the animation studio Pilot, the first non-governmental animation studio in the USSR, and in fact, one of the very first private businesses registered in the country during perestroika. This independence granted Pilot the freedom to experiment and push boundaries in ways that state-funded studios could not. The studio was founded by director and screenwriter Alexander Tatarsky, animator Igor Kovalyov, and art critic Anatoly Prokhorov. Pilot created animations not only for children but also for adults, a perfect fit for Kovalyov's distinct style, which was, well, creepy. Kovalyov's characters often have exaggerated, gravity-defying features, and his use of color creates a grimy, worn-down atmosphere that's instantly recognizable. Though Han, His Wife wasn't widely known within the USSR or its successor states, it became one of Pilot Studios' most internationally acclaimed works, significantly impacting Kovalyov's career. The film was showcased at numerous prestigious film festivals around the world and even earned a nomination for the Palme d'Or at the Cannes Film Festival. This animation draws heavily on the works of Sigmund Freud, particularly his 1900s publication, The Interpretation of Dreams. In this landmark work, Freud introduced a comprehensive catalogue of erotic symbolism based on his analysis of his patients' dreams. Over time, these symbols became widely known and established a cultural standard, shaping representations of erotic symbolism across literature, film, painting, and even animation. Many of these symbols appear in Han, His Wife, adding layers of psychological depth to its surreal narrative. The plot centers on the strange domestic life of a blue-skinned man who spends his days seated in an armchair, playing with toy cars and tending to a bizarre pet, a giant worm with a human head. His wife, an anthropomorphic hen, busies herself around the kitchen, embodying the archetype of a doting housewife. One day, a mysterious stranger barges into their home, bringing a peculiar gift for the husband, a box filled with ladybugs. The stranger notices the wife's claws and reveals to the husband that his wife is, in fact, a hen. Shocked by this revelation, the husband banishes her from their home and relishes his newfound solitude. However, time reveals his deep loneliness and he ultimately calls her back. Upon her return, she sees that her husband now has bird legs of his own. Distressed, she walks away. The symbolism in Han, his wife, is so dense that it feels like every element in the frame carries deeper meaning. The husband's blue color hints at his impotence, portraying him as dead in both marital and masculine sense. He wears striped clothing, reminiscent of a prisoner's uniform, and the frequent appearance of bars in the rapid cuts through the household setting reinforces his role as a captive, trapped within both his domestic life and his own insecurities. The husband's pet is a giant worm, a symbol Freud identified as representing a child. The worm is blue, just like the husband, and even shares some of his facial features. Its stiff hair resembles pubic hair, while its short, thick blue body evokes the image of a castrated phallus. And the husband spends considerable time with his worm, no pun intended, which hints at self-pleasure. It's no coincidence that the worm is fixated on a toy soldier. It's a clear nod to masturbation. Additionally, the energetic national Cherkess song that plays when the husband spins a toy car on the record player suggests that he feels a sense of masculinity when he plays with himself. So, in essence, the child of this marriage is a worm, a sentence which I never thought I would say. Freudian representation of the husband's cut off or non-functioning phallus, incapable of creating a real child due to his onanistic tendencies. The guest proceeds to disrupt the quiet comfort of the home by crushing a plate, symbolizing the breakdown of this family's asexual vegetative routine. At first, it's not immediately clear that this assertive, seductive stranger is actually an alter ego of the husband. However, for a split second, we see their faces merge, signaling that he represents a darker, more brutal aspect of the husband's personality. The guest brings with him a box of ladybugs, which Freud associates with children. However, these ladybugs are fed to the worm, reinforcing the idea that the husband's desires are misdirected and ultimately sterile because he blames his own wife for his sexual insecurities. The guest's appearance can be interpreted as a sudden awakening of the husband's sexual drive, but he can't direct this desire towards his wife because she's, well, a chicken. After banishing her, the husband emerges from the bathtub as if reborn. However, his sense of renewal is quite short-lived. When he begins playing with himself again, this time the toothpaste spills uncontrollably through the apartment. He becomes overwhelmed and drowns in his own pleasure, because his pleasure is unfulfilling without his wife. In response, he ties up the worm, symbolically repressing his desires, and calls his wife, asking her to return. She does, but now it's her turn to notice something. In that moment, I think she realizes that she's not inferior in any way, that her husband actually shares the same chicken claws as she does. And despite his apparent revival of manhood, symbolized by the rising elevator, she still chooses to leave. This animation is deeply layered and complex, so obviously the interpretations may vary. This is the reading that I find the most fitting, but if you have any other ideas, feel free to share them in the comments. After Han, his wife, enjoyed a successful festival run, Igor Kovalyov gained recognition abroad and was invited to the United States to meet with students at Disney Studios. During his visit, he crossed paths with Gabor Chupa, the Hungarian-born founder of Klasky Chupa, the animation studio behind Rugrats. Gabor invited Kovalyov to join his team, and though Kovalyov barely spoke a word of English, he eventually accepted. Over the next 15 years, Kovalyov became an integral part of Klasky Chupa, where he animated the iconic Rugrats series, co-created Real Monsters, and directed Rugrats the movie. He even later directed the pilot for Adult Swim's The Drinky Crow Show and contributed as an animator for, yes, The Simpsons. I guess now you can recognize his unusual, ugly style in our favorite characters. Despite spending so many years in the US though, Kovalyov never really considered himself an American animator. For him, it was simply about working where conditions were best for his craft. Gabor, as an immigrant himself, welcomed artists from diverse backgrounds, and Klasky Chupa's team was largely composed of Eastern European talent. Kovalyov himself even brought over several animators from his pilot studios, which led to tension with his former colleagues, especially with Alexander Tatarsky. Tatarsky wanted to stay in the newly formed Russian Federation to help shape post-Soviet media, while Kovalyov felt his priority was securing stable work for himself and his fellow Russian animators during the financially turbulent 1990s. Kovalyov eventually returned to Russia in 2010, initially due to his mother's illness. However, he stayed on after being offered to work with a very famous Russian-Kazakh producer Timur Bekmambetov, and ironically with Soyuz-Multfilm, the very studio he once wanted to escape due to its Soviet-era state control. I would say that Han, his wife, stands as a powerful symbol of the transformative period during Perestroika, showcasing the creative freedom that emerged as the Soviet Union's political landscape shifted. Thanks to this groundbreaking Soviet animation, Igor Kovalyov became a key figure in American animation, gifting us many cult cartoons that audiences all over the world grew up with.